That's okay. You're cleaning up. Yeah, I know.
If people could come in and take a seat, please.
So is this the mic? Do I have to stand right in front of that mic, or is it going to pick me up? Like here, in the range. Okay. Okay.
All right, let's get started. First off, I'd like to just welcome Dr. Eisen for joining us for this weekend, a Scholar in Residence weekend at Congregation of Good Adachim. We're very excited about this, and I want to welcome everyone for coming and joining us. Thank you for participating in this lecture series, both live and virtual. So just a few items. Rather than doing this at the end, I'm going to do it right now. I'd like to just thank my co-chair, Bas Korovar, the Adult Ed Committee, Rabbi Spitzer, the Schmidt family for hosting, and our professional staff, and of course catering, who already provided us with one delicious meal, with many more to come throughout the weekend. At the end of the lecture, I assume Dr. Eisen will take some questions. If you have questions, please come up and use the microphone so that everyone at home can hear your super intelligent question. But of course, there's, only good questions. There's no. All right, so some quick background on Dr. Eisen, at least according to what I found on Wikipedia. So we'll have to do a fact check on this. So in 2006, Dr. Eisen was appointed as the 7th Chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary. He is the second non-rabbi to hold this post. He is also the first person with a social science background to serve as Chancellor. Since his appointment, he increased JTS's impact on the communities it serves by transforming the education of religious leadership for conservative Judaism, articulating a new vision for JTS, guiding the formulation of a strategic plan to implement that vision, and developing innovative programs in synagogue arts and practices, adult education, pastoral care, Jewish thought, interreligious dialogue, and the arts. His initiatives include curricula for and synergy among all of JTS's 5 schools. Prior to his appointment, Dr. Eisen served in the Department of Religious Studies at Stanford University, where he at least tried to educate our own Steve Schmidt, the Department of Jewish Philosophy at Tel Aviv University, and the Department of Religion at Columbia University. Dr. Eisen earned a PhD in the history of Jewish thought from Hebrew University, a Bachelor of Philosophy in the Sociology of Religion at Oxford University, and a BA in Religious Thought from the University of Pennsylvania. He has authored multiple books, some of which are listed in the program. Several earned awards, including the National Book Award in 1987 for Galut, the National Jewish Book Award from the Koret Foundation in 1998 for Rethinking Modern Judaism. He has also been awarded the Koret Prize in 1999 for outstanding contributions to the Jewish community, and in 2018, he was awarded the Marshall Sklar Award. Dr. Eisen is married to Dr. Adrienne Levine, a professor of the Hebrew Bible at the Hebrew Union College. They have 2 children, Shuli, a recent graduate of Brandeis University, and Nathaniel, a student at Stanford University. Is any of that correct?
It's out of date.
It's out of date, but it's okay. So hopefully as the weekend progresses, we will learn more about Dr. Eisen, and we will get corrections to Wikipedia. Just a reminder, tomorrow morning, or actually tomorrow afternoon, is his next lecture at 1 p.m., Zionism Then and Now. And then following Havdalah, which is at 7:15, so at about 7:30, There will be a lecture, Engagement, a part and a part. And then finally, on Sunday morning, with Men's Club breakfast at 10:30, Imagining a Way Forward. So with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Eisen. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to stand over here so I don't have to wear the mask. But as I've said to the rabbi and others, if I had my druthers, I'd of course be down there because this is meant to be an intimate conversation. It's a very personal topic for all of us, and especially for me. So we use the word lecture, but this is not at all an academic lecture. I'm going to be drawing on my field, which is Judaism in the modern period, and my particular fields of expertise are what happens in America and what happens in Israel. And I'll be working from that scholarship, but I'll also be working from life experience, as you will hear. And this topic is one, the way that I'm going to conceive it, is one where we really need to be, good, thanks, where we really need to be willing to share our personal experiences and thoughts. I'm here at the suggestion of the rabbi and the Adult Education Committee as part of the synagogue's year-long conversation about this topic of relating to Israel. And it's a particularly vexing topic. So I want to thank everybody for inviting me. And I have to say that it's always a pleasure for me to speak at synagogues around the country. This is obviously the first synagogue talk like this I've given since the outset of COVID. It's probably the only one outside of my own synagogue in Riverdale that I'm going to be doing for this academic year. And it's just such a pleasure to meet with Jews and talk about the issues that we share and to exchange ideas. It's one of the greatest pleasures I have in life, and one of the reasons I became the chancellor was that for my 20 years as a professor at Stanford, I went around the country and did a lot of talks at synagogues, and I found that so satisfying that when I was offered the opportunity to make my full-time job the service to the Jewish community, instead of doing that on the side, I jumped at the chance and became the chancellor of JTS. So I'm going to go on now for something like 35 or 40 minutes, and then we'll stop and have some discussion, and we'll pick up tomorrow. I thought that what I would do tonight is explain word by word the reasoning behind the topic, renewing our relationship to Israel. The first reason to do this is because Jews have always done this. And I want to start there as a historian of Judaism. 5 minutes ago, we said Birkat HaMazon. And we say it so often we skip right by it, but you probably noticed that second paragraph, Nodeh Lecha, thanks God for an Aretz. And thanking God for this particular Aretz was a late addition which the conservative movement threw into Birkat HaMazon, but the original Birkat HaMazon does not thank God for this Aretz. It thanks God for Eretz Yisrael. But the rabbis who formulated these blessings are also punning on the fact that Hebrew, from the very beginning, uses this word Aretz in two senses. There's planet Earth, which is Eretz, and then there are particular Aretz, so like Eretz Mitzrayim and Eretz Israel, but there's only one Haaretz, the land. So wherever you are in the world as a Jew, for at least the past 2,000 years or so, you are in the first instance not thanking God for the fruit of the land you were in, Poland or Lithuania or Morocco or whatever. You are thanking God for the fruits of Eretz Israel. This is by design, because one of the things the rabbis set up when, after the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and then the Bar Kokhba rebellion failed 60 years later or so, the rabbis had to face in two different directions. They had a task of enabling Jews to remain as Jews in whatever lands they were in, at the same time as they had to remind Jews that they were not in the place that they should be. The world was out of joint. The Bible is not set up with exile in mind. And the rabbis could not conceive of any life outside the land of Israel that was not exile. In modern Hebrew, partly because of pressure from Jews like us who don't consider ourselves in exile, in modern Hebrew we have two different words. We have golah, which is, we translate like a dispersion, even though there's another word for that as well, but there's also galut. And I, as a Jew who had grown up in Philadelphia, as you're going to hear in a minute, and then spent crucial time in England during the 1973 war, and then went to do my PhD in Israel from 1975 to 1978, I really felt this pull in both directions. And to me, the rabbis are trying to create that pull. The rabbis want to make sure that if you're living in New York or Palo Alto or Schenectady or wherever you are, you know that in some ways you are at home if the Torah is with you, but in other ways you are not at home because you are not in the land of Israel, and then they attach the land of Israel to a kind of messianic fulfillment that even today cannot be yours if you are in the land of Israel. So we have a great number of Jews today living in the land of Israel. We call them Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox Jews, for whom Israel is by definition not home, it is exile, because they have inherited and are loyal to these categories that the rabbis set up 2,000 years ago, so that even if you are in Israel, you do not consider yourself fully at home, and the situation you are living in is not a situation of homeness, it's a situation of galut, or exile. If you know Hebrew, you know that the rabbis built this into the Grace After Meals in another way. Shir HaMa'alot, Psalm 126, which I think is one of the most beautiful pieces of liturgy we have in our tradition. Thanks to the glories of the Hebrew language, you can work simultaneously in past tense and in future tense. So if you read the translation, which is in the little blue books from the conservative movement that we use tonight, they translated that psalm as if it were in past tense. B'shuv Adonai achivat Zion hayinu kecholmim. But if you know Hebrew, you know Az Yimalei Schokpinu. Yimalei is in future tense. So what the rabbis do there, and this is obviously working on a biblical text, a psalm, the rabbis are taking advantage of the fact that in the Hebrew language we can live in two different tenses at the same time. We can look back at the time when God restored the exiles to the Promised Land, but even as we look back to that time, we also look forward to the time when God's going to do that again, and by rabbinic decree almost, the rabbis set it up so that that fulfillment is a messianic fulfillment. And this is of utmost significance. So what I've just done is introduce a theme that we're going to spend a lot of time on tomorrow at lunch when we look at the sources, because one of the reasons for the perplexity in Jewish life when it comes to dealing with the reality of the state of Israel in our time is that there is no precedent. I say this with authority, and it's not just I who's looked into this. There is no precedent in the entire history of Jewish thought until the modern Zionist movement for imagining a Jewish state in the land of Israel that will not usher in the days of the Messiah. Which is why the ultra-Orthodox Jews who are firmly sticking to their principles will not recognize the legitimacy of that state. It can't exist in terms of the framework set up by Jewish thought for 2,000 years. A state which is not a messianic state that returns the Jews to the land of Israel cannot exist. There's no place for it. And therefore, you have the anomaly, which we're all familiar with, but I'm grounding us now to introduce tomorrow's talk from lunchtime. We have the reality that we have ultra-Orthodox parties which until the recent coalition were in the government, but they will not fly the flag of the State of Israel and will not celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut at their yeshivot. So they're in the government but will not recognize the ultimate legitimacy of that government, because ultimate legitimacy does not come from a vote of the Jewish people or a partition resolution of the United Nations. It comes from God and Scripture, and there is no precedent there for the reality that exists. So, bottom line, which I'm trying to establish here in these opening remarks, is that A, we have a responsibility as Jews of this generation, which we've inherited from the Jews of every past generation, to find a way of relating to the land of Israel and keeping ourselves centered on that land, even as we live as Jews outside of it. And B, if this is a perplexing task for 21st century Jews in the United States of America, in different ways it has always been a perplexing task for Jews everywhere. It's never been a simple matter. So this notion of relating as a diaspora Jew to the land of Israel, to the people of Israel, and now to the state of Israel is a conundrum that Jews have had for a very long time, and God willing, they're going to have it for a long time to come. Because as long as there's going to be a state and there are going to be Jews living outside of it, we're going to have to figure out ways of relating to that state, and it's never going to be simple. So that's the first word I wanted to say. Now, if you focus in on, zoom in now, from the big view of 2,000 years of diaspora Jewish history, focus in on recent Jewish history, now we come to my particular expertise as a scholar on 20th century American Jewry. America has a different relationship to this problem than any other diaspora has ever had before. And that's because the American Jewish diaspora is as unprecedented in Jewish history as the state of Israel is. There has never been a diaspora community remotely like ours. Or to take the language that I use in my book, Galut, which I'm going to be drawing on tonight. This is a book that came out in 1986, and I'm not plugging it because you can't buy it unless you can find a used copy on Amazon somewhere. But I was, because of my own biography, fascinated by the fact that America presents a distinctive set of issues, and you find a split between the way American Jewish thinkers and Israeli Jewish thinkers consider the idea of home, homelessness, homecoming, galut, all these ideas that have been swirling around in our tradition that we held in common for the past 2,000 years. America represents a novum because American Jews like to think of ourselves correctly as different from any previous diaspora. And we are different because the opportunities open to Jews here are just unimaginable, not just unprecedented, but unimaginable in any previous diaspora in which Jews have lived. So that despite rising levels of anti-Semitism, which we're facing here, the levels of anti-Semitism here do not compare to the levels of anti-Semitism in Latin America and in Western and Central and Eastern Europe. They just do not compare. North America is a very different case. That the openness, the opportunities that are open to Jews here are just so amazing, so that we carry around with us a consciousness of at-homeness which did not come naturally to American Jews before my generation. I'm 70 now, and my parents were born and raised in Philadelphia. Their parents were the immigrants, which is a typical story for American Jews. But I have to tell you, having done research on this subject, that if you are an American Jew and you feel pretty much at home here, chances are good that your parents, even if they were born and raised here, did not feel at home to the same extent and in the same way. Just to take one example, which struck me when I was doing research on American Jewish thought. I wanted to figure out what the social and economic and political background to this religious thought was. So it turns out that my parents had no close friends that were not Jews. And from the data I learned that my parents were totally typical in that regard, that most American Jews in the 50s and well into the 60s did not have close friends who were not Jews. And according to the literature, that's because ultimately you couldn't trust non-Jews not to turn into anti-Semites. And you felt that as a Jew, if you let your guard down and behaved in a way that did not uphold the full honor of the Jewish people, you'd be doing damage to Jews because you'd give anti-Semites a chance to react. It's also true, I think you probably know this, but maybe not, well into the 1960s, intermarriage between Jews and Gentiles was in single digits. Single digits. And now it's well above 50% of Jews who marry people who are not Jews. So this is a totally different environment than Jews have ever lived in before. The Zionism that we're going to look at tomorrow has no room for reality like this. So just like Jewish thought of the previous 2,000 years had no imagination of a reality of a sovereign Jewish state existing in the land of Israel, classical Zionism, and this Zionism, as you're going to see tomorrow, is echoed by Israeli leaders down to the present day, has no place for reality like the reality of American Jewry, because we are unique. So that makes the problem that much more distinctive. It's a problem without an easy solution because the realities are different. Now I want to zoom in one step further. Let's look at today or the last 20 years or so. Some people think that the problem of so-called distancing from Israel is a new problem. I should say, by the way, that the reality of distancing is established. What is established statistically is that every succeeding age cohort of Jews in the United States moves farther and farther away from engagement with Israel. It stands to reason, it's obvious. If you were born and raised during the Holocaust and during the creation of the state, your relationship to that place is visceral. If you're like me, born in 1951, I don't know where I got this, but I must have picked it up at Hebrew school as a child, that I was born in 1951, and the State of Israel was born in 1948, and the Holocaust ended in 1945, 6 short years before I was born. And so Jewish history imprints itself on you. And then you get to the generation that experienced the 1967 war. And of course, for those of us who are old enough to have remembered that war, I was 16, that has a major impact on your life and shapes your relationship to Israel. And then there's the 1973 war, and I know from reflection that a large part of my relationship to Israel is due to the fact that I experienced that war having just arrived as a graduate student at Oxford University in England, and for the first time in my life was surrounded by anti-Zionism, and there was even a lot of anti-Semitism, and I was shocked. The 1967 war in Philadelphia, where everybody seemed to be pro-Israel, the 1973 war in England, where everybody seemed to be anti-Israel, this was a shock to the system, and I think it's because of that shock that I ended up writing a book about Galut, or exile. But it's certainly because of that experience, because I made a vow during the war that whatever I did next in life, I was going to do it in Israel. And it turned out what I did next in life was a PhD in Jewish thought, so it's perfectly obvious to go to Israel to do that. So I went dramatically from a situation that I had to describe as exile to a situation that was a sort of homecoming. And so I was living in my biography this central core of Zionist ideology that the return to the land of Israel can be a return to some kind of fullness, some kind of homecoming, right? And I lived it, I experienced it, but 1975, when I got to Israel, is 47 years ago. And so one can't expect Jews who don't have this kind of biographical background to have the same sort of relationship to Israel, and in fact, all the data shows that they don't. And my current undergraduates, whom I'm teaching at JTS, we have an undergraduate program, as well as graduate programs, so they're 18 or 19 years old. So they're born in the 90s. So they don't remember pre-Intifada. So my point here is that a relationship is not just like a political opinion. A relationship is not a view. It's not like let's have an idea. A relationship is that your person is involved with this place. It's like having a relationship with the person. And so the relationship is a merger, is a meeting of your biography with the biography of that place. Just like your relationship with the person is a function of your biography and that person's biography. And America Jewry is not where it was even 20 or 30 years ago. And Israeli Jewry and the state of Israel is certainly not where it was even 20 or 30 years ago. So there's extra special need right now to do a renewal and a rethinking, because we are not where the founders of Zionism were. We are not where the founders of the state were. We are not where we were in 1967 or 1973. America is a different place. Israel is a different place. We are different Jews. Israeli Jews are different Jews. And so there's a time now for a rethinking. I want to give you two more reasons why I think this rethinking is important. And I have to emphasize here, I wish I could be down there with you to make it clear that we're not plotting policy for the federation movement. We're not planning the next generation of AIPAC meetings. These are important things, but we're here to think about our relationship as individuals and as this community to Israel. And so it's all the more important that we not just do the sociology. So when I do the sociology, it's background, but the real heart of the matter is where we ourselves are. But I want to do two more pieces of background before turning squarely to the we ourselves. Number one, there's a political importance to this relationship. So you can't, I'm not here to do politics this weekend, but I think it's fair to say, I'm going to say this with, I hesitate to claim expertise for it because it involves the future, and none of us are experts on the future. But from everything I know about Jewish history and the current situation, I think it's folly to rely on the state of Israel to protect itself from its enemies without the help of America. I think that's a pretty non-controversial statement, although there are some Israelis who would say, no, we don't need you anymore, but I don't think that that's true. And I also don't think, and here I'm making a political judgment, I do not think that that Israel should rely on a combination of Orthodox Jews and evangelicals to sway the American government in support of Israel. I think that is too risky. American Jewry as a whole, all 6 or 7 million of us, are needed for this effort. And even though you know the statistics as well as I do, perhaps you're not familiar with this shocking statistic that less than 40% now of American Jews belong to anything Jewish. Less than 40% will write a check this year to any Jewish organization whatsoever. So we speak about ourselves as an American Jewish community of 6 or 7 million, but in real terms, more than 60% of that community are totally unaffiliated, and many of them are alienated. And yet, I say this, and yet, because for this purpose, they vote. American Jews vote in very large numbers and contribute to political campaigns in very large numbers, so the support of American Jewry for Israel, in my estimation, is absolutely indispensable to the well-being of Israel. You sometimes hear Israeli politicians, and Bibi in some of his moments has said this, we don't need American Jewry anymore, we have the Orthodox and we have the evangelicals and that's enough. Bibi is very smart about these things, so on this one I think he was wrong. But there's another reason why I think this rethinking is necessary for us, and that's because we need it and the Israelis need it. If you have a Jewish population, which maybe numbers 16, 17 million, in a world of nearly 8 billion, it is absolute folly for the two largest Jewish communities in the world not to have close relationships with each other. And sadly, the fact of the matter is that except for leaders on both sides, those two communities do not have a close relationship with each other. And it's often been pointed out, this is not my claim, this is the claim of people who know more about the subject than I do. American Jews are woefully ignorant of everything Jewish, including the State of Israel. And Israeli Jews, because of the way they are educated, are woefully ignorant of diaspora Jewry. So Israeli Jews do not study you and me in school. Just as most American Jews, of course, don't get a serious Jewish education, so they don't study the reality of Israel in school. So we're looking at a situation where we've had 2,000 years of relationship, never simple, where you have this unprecedented reality on that side of a sovereign Jewish state in the land of Israel, the unprecedented reality on our side of an American Jewry, which is different than any previous diaspora, and you have solid evidence, I think incontrovertible, that in the last 20 or 30 years, these two communities are moving further and further apart. This is not a new phenomenon. It's been going on for some time. But here we are. So we had a Pew report. Pew Research does a survey. They did one in 2013, and they did another one this year. And I'm putting on my glasses so I can read my typed summary. So the percentage of American Jews who have been to Israel even once is still less than half. That's better than it was a few years ago. But the overwhelming majority of American Jewish adults travel abroad. So the overwhelming majority of American Jewish adults who travel abroad have chosen not to include Israel in their travels. That's a datum. I don't interpret things like this without evidence, and we don't have solid evidence of what the reasoning is, but that is a significant datum. 8 in 10 say that an essential or important part of being Jewish is to relate to the state of Israel. But the percentage of American Jews that's very attached to Israel is now 25%. The percentage of American Jews that say that they are somewhat attached to Israel is 32%. So add the two together, and well over 40% of American Jews say they have no attachment to Israel whatsoever and don't care about that lack of attachment. Right? So that's where we are. When you talk about an American Jewish community, you're talking about over 40% that have no relationship, and the middle group are somewhat attached, but most of that middle group does not know very much, does not read Hebrew literature in translation, does not go to Israeli movies with subtitles, does not watch news, etc., etc., etc. So you have a situation where those of us who care, for one reason or another, are going to be a minority. And people used to ask me as chancellor, when I was representing the conservative movement, was I upset about our shrinking numbers? Well, of course I'm not pleased by them, but if you're Jewish and care about the Jewish future, you can't play the numbers game because Jews have never won on numbers. If you are 16 million in a world of 8 billion, you're not winning on numbers. If you are a conservative Jew, you are not winning on numbers. You have maybe 14% in terms of membership or 12% in terms of membership, but we're not playing numbers here. So if we are Jews who care, part of caring about this people, caring about this tradition, is caring about this land, this place, and now this state. And I'll talk about how one cares and why one cares in a moment. So everything I've done thus far has been to kind of set up the weekend. So that's the rethinking, and that's the relationship. And now let's say a little more about the hour. And I'm going to talk about me. And baby boomers are famous for loving to talk about ourselves. And I am a baby boomer, quintessentially, and I love talking about myself and my biography. But the point of this is I believe there's no other way to talk about a relationship with Israel except one by one. And as I talk, I'm hoping that you're going to be thinking, whoever you are, about your own biography and Israel's biography and where you stand and where you'd like to stand, etc., etc. So there are a few things in my biography, just so you know where I'm coming from. I've already told you a couple of them, but let me go and say a couple more. So I get to Israel in 1975 to do a PhD. And I discover a country that has been traumatized. I sat in England from 1973 to 1975, so I knew it intellectually, but until I actually got there, I didn't understand how close Israel came to destruction in 1973. If that armored tank battle had not won on the Golan Heights, we wouldn't be able to visit Israel today. And all my friends, all my Israeli friends, all the men had either been they'd all been in the war, had special reasons for not being in the war, and all the women had known people who had been in the war, and everybody knew people who had died in the war. And so it was like a serious time. And I discovered a couple things, not by reading books, but by life experiences that changed me and made me, as it were, more of a Zionist or more engaged with Israel than I had been before. Let me name two. Number one, I, to this day, like to listen to the radio before I fall asleep at night. It helps me fall asleep. So, in 1975, in Israel, there was only one radio station that stayed on all night. And that was the army radio station, called Galei Tzahal. And I would, remember dials, there were dials on radios, and I would turn the dial, and the dial would be Arabic, 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 Israeli Army, Arabic, 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 Arabic. And you didn't have to be a genius to draw a lesson from that, which was that I'm living in this tiny little place, surrounded by people who don't want me to be there, and the only thing that's enabling me to be there, against the desire of all these people who don't want me to be there, is the Israeli army. Whatever your opinions about politics, they don't matter. The point is that your life is in the hands of the Israeli army, and without them, you're not there. You're gone. The second thing was I rode buses. I rode buses to see the country, and I rode buses because my relatives were in a town called Afula up north, and to get to Afula, there was a bus that drove straight through the West Bank. We got to Afula, and when you rode the buses, you met the Jewish people, because Israel was still a nation of immigrants, very much so. And I had the experience of meeting people who barely spoke Hebrew, whose faces looked completely different than my face. There were certainly different complexions, different colors than my face was, and yet they were Jews, and for reasons I could not figure out at the time, I felt responsible for them. Of course, I had studied Jewish thought, and I was there doing a PhD in the history of modern Jewish thought, but the feeling of Kol Yisrael Arivim Zel Lezel, which I studied as a kid in Hebrew school, a responsibility for fellow Jews, did not come from books. It came from that experience of riding those buses. And I was an American Jew, which meant that I was on college campuses, University of Pennsylvania in my case, during the Vietnam War. And like most students on college campuses, I was not a big fan of the Vietnam War. And when the Philadelphia police came onto campus to break up demonstrations to get the Vietnam War and used their batons and had guns, I was not a big fan of the Philadelphia police force. But when I took those bus rides and Israeli soldiers got on and sat down next to me with Uzis on their lap, I was very happy to have those soldiers sitting next to me with those Uzis, because I knew again that buses got attacked periodically, and that my life was in the hands of the soldiers with the Uzis. So you don't arrive at these opinions through book learning or taking ideological courses. There are certain life experiences. Now, there was another kind of life experience that I had in Israel, which was I would spend a lot of time going to the Western Wall. And I never felt any particular connection to the wall. I never felt closer to God at the wall. But when I walked a couple hundred yards away from the wall and stood on those stones looking eastward at the Dead Sea, I kind of identified with prophets. Not that I was a prophet, but I identified with this notion of the sun is beating down on you from above, the stones are there beneath your feet, the sands of this desert are there as far as your eye can see, and Kadosh, 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 Malei Chol Haaretz Kvodo. Somehow you get a sense, because there's so many religious people at this place, that you're part of a transcendent story. And I never felt this more keenly than in Jerusalem. And the fact that there were really super religious Muslims and super religious Christians and super religious Jews in the same place really drove it home for me. As an American Jew, I felt like something is at stake here. And it's not just for us that it's at stake. And I had so many experiences, I can't tell you all of them right now, but I'll just tell you one and move on from that to something else. So one day, I'm there with my wife and kids. I have a sabbatical from Columbia. It's 1989, it's this already. We're back. By the way, I should interrupt myself to tell you this other story, which is that having come home from Israel after my years of PhD, I decided I'm going to make Aliyah. And I decided I'm not going to date anybody seriously who's not willing to make Aliyah with me. And my wife, who had been raised in young Judea, had come to the same conclusion. My future wife had come to the same conclusion. So we found ourselves engaged, living in Israel in the summer of 1982 during the Lebanese War. So we shared that together. And that only firmed up our desire to make Aliyah. And in August 1982, we got married. And Rabbi Arthur Green, who was a good friend of mine, married us, and under the chuppah, said how wonderful it was that these two young people were planning to make Aliyah together, and our parents had not heard about that plan until that moment under the chuppah. So our parents were not exactly happy with this plan, but we made Aliyah, and then we came home, largely for financial reasons, and I'm an only child, etc., etc. Wanted to be near my parents, did not want to raise children that far away from them. But every sabbatical we went back. So in 1989, we're there on sabbatical, and I pick up the phone, and I hear a voice in there that says, Khan Lipschitz. This is Lipschitz here. And I wasn't totally bewildered because I'd been prepared by a friend of mine that this character Lipschitz may call me. Lipschitz, I'm not sure he's still alive, but he is or was an ultra-Orthodox Neturei Karta Jew whose hobby was the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. And he had heard from this mutual friend of ours that I had written an article about Nietzsche and the Jews, and so he wanted to meet me to come talk to me about Nietzsche. This is why I love Israel, stories like this. So he lives in a hovel on the second floor of a little house in Mea Shearim. What he does for a living, such as it was, is make tefillin. So he lives in a 3-room apartment. The entry room is full. Every bookcase, floor to ceiling, is Nietzsche in every language and works about Nietzsche. For those of you who don't know Nietzsche, there is some element of anti-Semitism in the German philosopher Nietzsche. I'm not sure he's entirely responsible for the use the Nazis made of him, but the Nazis loved Nietzsche. Right? He had a concept of the Superman you may have heard of. So here's this guy who makes tefillin. And the back room, separated from this, is where he makes tefillin. So there's like a holy room and a treif room, and then there's a kitchen and a bathroom. And at the end of it, we have a long conversation about Nietzsche. He takes me out on the balcony, which overlooks the old city. And he says, you know, either the three religions of the world are going to learn how to get together in peace in this place, or this is going to be Armageddon. It's one of the most profound things anyone had ever said to me in my life. And from that person in that place, it seems absolutely correct. Again, there's more at stake in this place than just us. Something else is going on, and you live there, you carry on that sense. Next stage, we make Aliyah. I'm going backwards now. In 1984, we made Aliyah, and I'm teaching at Tel Aviv University. I'm teaching Israeli students in Hebrew. And it's one of the thrills of my life to be able to teach Israeli students in Hebrew. Most of them have just done their army service, and they're asking themselves why they want to be there. And one of the students, I've just been working on this book on the idea of exile, and I taught a course on the idea of exile. This is the last autobiographical story I'm going to tell. And one of the students says to me at a certain point in this course, "Bishvil ma kol zeh? Anachnu lo tzrichim et zeh." What do we need this for? Ele ha'etzim shelanu, zot ha'ar shelanu, zeh hashamayim shelanu. So these are our trees, this is our land, this is our sky. We don't need all these ideas. And I couldn't tell him, you're not going to feel that way 5 years from now when you've had your first taste of moving to Palo Alto, etc., etc. The level of Yerida in Israel, the number of leaving Israel was quite high then. But I understood what he was saying. For me, as a diaspora Jew, I had to work out a relationship. For him, it was home. The trees were his trees. When he dreams in Hebrew. This, to me, is the most profound difference in the relationship between Israeli Jews and Jewish tradition and American Jews. Not so much that they learn Hebrew as kids and speak Hebrew easily and so have access to the sources. The fact that the language an Israeli Jew prays in is the same language the Israeli Jew dreams in is different, because when I dream in English, except when I'm in Israel. I dream in English, but when I walk into this synagogue, I'm suddenly praying in Hebrew. There are advantages to that. It can be a holy language because it's not your everyday language. It has a different resonance. But it's not the language of my dreams. And that makes a very big difference. So, this whole section of the talk, to recap, is to make the point that a relationship is a meeting of biographies. And we can't be distressed that the current generation of American Jews, especially American Jewish young people, does not feel connected to Israel because they have not had the set of biographical experiences which would enable them to do that. So Birthright was designed to sort of address this issue. Birthright aimed to have 100% of its age cohort go to Israel. Birthright got around 25% of its age cohort of American Jews to go to Israel. And that's one of the reasons why you have this enormous statistic that over 50% of American Jews have never been to Israel, even once. Well, I want to say something else about the hour and about the Israel that we're relating to. The hour is a combination of individuals and collective. We'll talk about this tomorrow, but one of the differences between Israeli Jews and American Jews, which makes it hard for them to relate to us and hard for us to relate to them, is that we are Jews as individuals, they are Jews as a collective. Yeah, you can leave the country. But if you're an 18-year-old man in good health, you're going to be drafted. You're going to serve in the army. You're going to risk your life. It's hard to get an exemption. Some people do, but it's not easy. And if you're a woman, chances are good you're going to serve as well. The collective forces itself upon you at every place. If you're a Jew in America, you choose not just once, but repeatedly, whether and how to relate to this people and this tradition, and certainly to the state of Israel. So for them it's collective, for us it's individual, and we achieve individually. Yeah, there are some marvelous collective achievements of American Jewry. We have a federation system which spends and raises and spends more money than many countries that exist in the world. And the billions of dollars every year, raised by Jews, spent on Jews, and not just for Jews. But most of our achievement in this country is individual. It's a great scientist, or a great artist, or a great comedian, or a great athlete, or whatever. It's individual. There are some communities, some great synagogues, there are movements like the feminist movement where we achieve things collectively. But for the most part, the State of Israel is an incredible collective achievement, and American Jewry is an individual achievement. And so it's hard for us to be an our, for us to be a we, for us to be a collective in any sense. It's hard for us to come together as an American Jewish community. Most American Jews have never experienced the American Jewish community. They don't know what it is. It's a fiction for them. Totally a fiction. Finally, I want to say one more thing, and then this will take us into tomorrow's Dvar Torah. I did not become a Zionist primarily by reading the works of Theodor Herzl or Ahad Ha'am or Rav Kook or any other people that we're going to study tomorrow. I became a Zionist by reading the book of Deuteronomy. That's why I call myself a religious Zionist. This book, we're now finishing the first book of the Torah. The first book of the Torah, Bereshit, begins in exile, the Garden of Eden. It ends in exile in Egypt. The last book of the Torah begins in exile and ends right across the Jordan for entering the Promised Land. Deuteronomy puts you in a position where you're about to cross a river into new possibilities that have never existed before. These are really exciting possibilities. And I want to say that when I was encountering that book as a young adult, say the age of 20, 21, 22, it struck me that the book of Deuteronomy was describing my life. And certainly the notion of Israel across that narrow river pulled me. It seized me. And when we decided, for reasons I'll talk about tomorrow, to come back and build a life here, as we're doing, and I think it's perfectly possible to build a meaningful, fulfilling Jewish life in America, otherwise I wouldn't be doing it, and certainly would not have led a Jewish institution, I still feel the pull of the book of Deuteronomy. And I believe that if we are here today talking about our relationship to Israel, it's because all of us, to some extent, being Jews and saying grace after meals and reading the Torah year after year, feel that same pull. There's something in this tradition of ours which wants us, even when we're living somewhere else, to be pulled toward that place. It somehow doesn't let go of you. And so it's up to us to figure out how we're going to respond to that pull. All right, I said I would talk a lot less than I just did, but we have time now for questions. I hope we can go a few minutes later than 8:15. Somebody in the room have a question before we turn to the Zoom? Please come forward to the mic, right? Are you going to ask one or set up the mic?
Hi. You talk about your biography, but I'm very curious to hear about the biography of your children. Maybe not in details, but how is it similar or how is it different from yours?
My children are totally different. So, again, it's like, so the question is how are my children related to Israel? My daughter was born there. My daughter was born in Hadassah Hospital in Mount Scopus. And what that means is she has a passport. And when we went back when she was 3.5 years old, she got child's Hebrew, immersive Hebrew, which is still inside of her. So she feels herself to be connected to that place because she has the passport and she has the language inside of her, and she's been back several times since. She lives in Los Angeles with a husband who was born and raised in Los Angeles. I doubt that very much they'll ever make Aliyah, but they feel connected. But they don't feel connected in the same way I do because they haven't had that same set of experiences. My son was born at Stanford University Hospital, does not feel the same connection. He's been back several times. I think it's something that they have to work out. My daughter went on birthright. My son did not. But we'll see. Like this is, I think I'm typical in that respect of an American Jewish parent. So if the younger generation's relationship is lesser than my generation, that's entirely to be expected. Sad but true, and we just have to deal with it. Who's going to take the, is somebody going to watch the live stream for?
American Jews feel equal among equals, so to speak. The freest society are equal. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
We feel we are equal among equals. The freest society, the freest, let's say, ethnic group of any place in the world. We're used to being, how shall I say, accepted and recognized. Is it possible the way American Jews are treated from a religious point of view creates an alienation? And after so many decades of saying, you don't count, you're not authentic, you're not real, we begin to sort of say, all right, we'll just go our own way.
So there are a lot of people who believe that if we had a little bit more anti-Semitism in America, it would be very good for Jewish identity. It might happen. We'll see. But I think the majority reaction to anti-Semitism would be to hide and not to come forward. So I hope we never see that experiment played out, but if we did, I don't think it's going to be very helpful to Jewish identity. We'll see. The fact is that most American Jews tell the surveys that they expect to see serious anti-Semitism in their lifetimes, and young Jews say this even more than older Jews do. Maybe because they have a longer lifetime expected, and so there's more chance for the anti-Semitism to rear its head. Pittsburgh and Charlottesville were shocks to the system of the American Jewish community, right? So I don't know what's going to be, and I think that here's where you get into the realm of speculation firmly and out of any kind of knowledge base. But our position vis-a-vis Christianity and Islam is so complicated and so difficult that I cannot imagine a world that is overwhelmingly Christian and Muslim which does not have a significant bit of anti-Semitism in it. Just because history is too powerful to resist, and the sacred texts are what they are. What's interesting now, in the ascension of China, which I think is the story of this century aside from climate change, right? Hopefully not viruses, but climate change in China apparently is where we're going to be for a while. China will be the first great world civilization with which Jews have no history to speak of. There's no anti-Semitism built into Chinese civilization. There's no Confucian sacred texts that are down on Jews. So we'll see what happens. But by the same token, when we speak about the future of American Jewry, people ask me, what's going to be with American Jewry in 20 or 30 years? The answer is, American Jewry as we know it is premised on the supremacy, the post-war supremacy of America in the world. You take away that American dominance, or if we have to share dominance with China, American Judaism will be something different than the Judaism that we have known in our lifetimes. It's unpredictable, because that's unpredictable. So the future, I don't want to sound pretentious, but it seems to me the future is more uncertain than it's been in a very long time. And the future for Jews is so uncertain. So on the one hand, we have a state, but on the other hand, you have Iran, right? So I don't know, I know what I hope and pray the future of that state is, but the Iranians have other ideas, apparently. So, I don't know. And the Chinese, do the Chinese care that there's a Jewish state? I doubt they care one way or the other. So they will do what's in their interest. So this is a complicated time for us. I think we can't disguise this from ourselves. And in a small room among a small number of Jews, one can talk about these things honestly. It's very difficult to say these kinds of things in large numbers in public. But I think we're in a very difficult situation, all the more reason for all 16 million of us to know how to talk to each other. And you want to take one more question?
I want to amplify and follow up on my friend Murray's question. A couple of things that are happening at the same time is that liberal Judaism in the USA is diminishing. It's less affiliated. It's a lot less literate. And at the same time, American liberal Jews are frequently, increasingly feeling that the Orthodox-dominated establishment in Israel is saying, there's no place for you. How do you see these two things playing out, I guess, individually in their own countries and as American and Israeli Jews look at each other?
Yeah, so I'll address the question, but not in great detail because this is tomorrow lunch and Sunday morning when we look forward. So I'll just preview and say that I wrote a piece for the American Jewish Committee in 1990 about the growing divide between American Jews and Israelis. Why that's important is that this is long before the ascension of the Haredim in Israel and before the rise of Bibi. So yes, the politics of the Israeli government have alienated some liberal American Jews, and the Haredi power and the use they make of it, like the Kotel decision, et cetera, alienate American Jews. But I'm of the opinion that these factors exacerbate a trend which was there beforehand and would have happened anyway because the two societies are so different, and we are, as Jewries, are moving in two very different directions. So I already talked too long, so I won't do this book tonight, I'll do it tomorrow. But the fact is that American Jewish thought until recently has paid zero attention. American Jewish religious thought pays zero attention to statehood. Our prayer books, except for the prayer for the state of Israel, are unchanged. You might say, well, of course, we're 2,000 years old. Israel's only been around for 70-some years. Why should they change? But the Israelis think that everything is totally different now. You had a Passover Haggadah this Passover, right? If you used the same Haggadah I did, it ended without going into the land of Israel. The rabbis did that Haggadah. It's for diaspora. The kibbutzim, as you know, look at that Haggadah and say, we can't use a Haggadah like that. The story doesn't end with the Exodus. The story ends when the Israelites get to the Promised Land. So we have to add a new part to the Haggadah to make clear that Passover is not just about an Exodus. Passover is about a homecoming. Right? You see, so they're on a different wavelength than we are. And the stuff that's being creatively done in Israel, Jewishly right now, is mind-boggling. But I would also say really creative stuff is being done in America Jewishly. And some of it is transferable and some of it is not. So part of our job is to understand both, like why they're doing stuff that we can't follow and how we can translate from them to us and from us to them. It's a really different scene. It's fascinating. I'll stop here and just say, if this was only an academic problem, it'd be fascinating. The problem is that this is our lives. Something profound for us is at stake in this. So we can't just be interested in it. It's a problem we have to deal with. And we're not going to solve it. Our kids are not going to solve it, but we're going to be enriched by tackling it. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Eisen. Great start to our Scholar in Residence weekend. Look forward to the next lectures. Again, tomorrow, obviously, Shabbat services start at 12:15. I'm sorry, yeah. Hold on. There we go. Yeah, 9:15. They're going to be quick, though. 9:15. And then there'll be a luncheon, followed by a 1 o'clock lecture. Again, Zionism Then and Now. Havdalah will be at 7:15, followed by a 7:30 lecture, Engagement, a part and a part. And then there'll be a reception in the evening after that lecture. And then Sunday morning, Sunday morning service is at 8:30. Men's Club breakfast will be at 9:30, and the final lecture of this series, Imagining a Way Forward, will be at 10:30. So please join us for those. The ones on Shabbat are only on YouTube. The live feed, the Saturday evening and the Sunday morning post-Shabbat will be on Zoom. So those will be interactive, hopefully, if the technology works. So right now, those here, and I guess those at home, if you would like to go have dessert, please do. Thank you.